All right, we are now broadcasting live. This is Armin Navobi from Atheist Republic, and we are with
Aron Ra, and I don't know what title I have at the moment, but I am running for Texas State Senate District 2.
Awesome. And tell us a little bit about that. And first, tell us a little bit about your. I mean, a lot of people already know you, but for the people that don't, tell us a little bit about what you do, what you have been doing, your activism, and your plans as for running for a Senate, and how can people support that, and your views.
All right. Well, I've been for the last 20 years or so. I've been an atheist activist. I'm an advocate of public education, specifically science education. Although we have my wife and I, as an activist, also we have been to the state capitol a couple of times. We've testified to the Board of Education regarding science, sex, and social studies, because they want to put in religious messages to undermine education in everything they can, not just misrepresenting science. I mean, we have science textbooks that say that Moses was a real person who really lived and who was born 3,200 years ago in 1250 BC, right? And they don't understand. And I had to tell the Board of Education that Moses is a faith-based belief, that there is no evidence that Moses ever existed, that there's a scholarly consensus that Moses did not exist, and that even those who believe that Moses did exist cannot agree on when he should have lived. I mean, you have people that are running him like throughout the second millennium BCE, and nobody can pin down which pharaoh was supposed to be involved, because none of them actually match. So that it is a bit of a stretch to go out and we always argue that you can't state something as fact that is not a fact.
Right.
So if you don't know what date he was born, or even any general approximation of where he was born, because none of the scholars agree on this, then you can't say that he was born at this time. You can say some people believe he was born at this time, but you can't just state it out, right? If it's not knowledge, you shouldn't misrepresent it as such.
And this is being taught in what, history books?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Now, see, they've done some insidious things here in the school board in Texas. I mean, they don't just teach religion. They do a kind of a whitewash. And when I mean whitewash, I mean a racial whitewash. A few years ago, they eliminated every ethnic reference that they could from our history books, so that you would think that Texas no longer had Hispanic Americans, right? That we no longer had any Mexican immigrants, that we didn't have Native Americans already here. That they just took away everything, like all of the black civil rights leaders and everything. They tried to eliminate Justice Thurgood Marshall, which was on the Supreme Court, and they didn't want there to be, I think it was the Supreme Court. They didn't want there to be any black role models in positions of authority. So you can see how racist this is. You can see that it's ethnocentric. They wanted only a Christian message. So they said in our history books, in our social studies books, it actually says, and a couple of them, that implications to the effect that our U.S. Constitution is based on a covenant between God and Moses.
Wow.
Which isn't remotely true. The founding fathers did not base any part of the Constitution on anything having to do with Moses. As a matter of fact, the government that Moses promoted is directly opposite of the one that the founding fathers came up with. They came up with they wanted to get something that was as far away from Mosaic law as was possible to get. So every bit of our education is nothing but misrepresentation and censorship. It's been very disturbing.
Why do you think in a country as advanced as the United States, which is responsible for so much science, which is responsible for the moon landing, which is responsible for so much advance in human understanding of the world, why do you think that in such a country you could still find religious teaching in history classes? And is this something that is a new trend, then compared to before, or has always been like this? Or a lot of atheists and maybe in other countries are surprised to see that in a country that they they would consider to be beyond these things, people are still going to school and learning that Moses was like, the story of
Yeah.
Moses was a real story.
And it's worse than that, because there were some history books that were being considered, when the state evaluates these different books. One of them was stating that that the colonists, or the people who founded Africa, or established populations in Africa, they called them a Hamitic race, which is a nonsense. It's not an actual race of people. These are supposed to be the sons of Ham, who is a son of Noah, who never existed from a flood that never happened.
Hmm.
So, I mean, this is just religion integrated everywhere.
So why do you think this is happening?
The reason that this is happening is because when this country was established, not when the first colonists came here, the first people that come to this country, the Pilgrims, as everybody talks about, they had the Puritans that came out here, and they were escaping religious persecution, because every Christian denomination savors persecution like nothing else. And then, a lot of other religions are also getting persecuted too. So they fled here. But then as soon as they got here, they began to visit persecution on each other. So that you had the Puritans were torturing the Quakers, for example, and then you'd had war with the Protestants and the Catholics, both in Europe and in the States, and you people just having constant conflicts with each other. So what the founding fathers did, a few of them were actual Christian, the way that we would understand them, like Trinitarian Christians as we have today. A few would call themselves Christian, but Unitarian Christians, which is virtually deist. And then some of them were just out and out deist, and they were the next best thing to atheist. So if they had any kind of a Darwinian explanation for the origin of species, I'm sure that many of them would have been atheist. But lacking that scientific explanation, a lot of them held to this deistic concept of a God. But these were some of the best educated men in history. I mean, these people had a wealth of knowledge and education. The founding fathers were wealthy landowners, so they didn't have to work for a living, and all they did was study. And so these men studied philosophy and history, and they based the Constitution on the works of John Locke and on Greek philosophers,
Right.
not Moses remotely. But what ended up happening was in the culture that grew up around the early United States, there were religious objectionists who were upset at the fact that there was such secularism in the government. I mean, that they had established a wall of separation between church and state. And so the religious people felt very much suppressed in this environment. So they had, in the early 1800s, they had the first revival movements. Now, this is a rural movement, so that they're trying to reinstall religion at the grassroots level. And so they had a series of religious revivals all over the country until what was in the late 1700s, religion was very much under control here, but it sprouted again in the early 1800s. It just took off. I mean, you allowed people to carry the religious documents, or the early the pioneers in this country respected the fact that most of these people came from a Christian background, so they allowed them their Christian books, by preference or whatever. And then realized later what a damaging mistake that is, and how also it was being mischaracterized to favor the United States as a Christian country, which is why they made early statements when they were trying to establish the Treaty of Tripoli. They're working with Muslim countries, and they say, now, and the Muslim countries wouldn't work with us if we were a Christian nation. And of course, they had to make a declaration, and this was unanimous. Now, this was voted unanimously throughout Congress that the United States is not a Christian nation in any sense,
Mm-hmm.
and it is not founded on Christianity. And this was declared unanimously throughout Congress in the early 1800s. But then by the end, with so many revivals and everything, I think we had our first Trinitarian Christian president. And everybody thinks that every president in the United States was a Trinitarian Christian, and that was not the case. I think he was the sixth president, Andrew Jackson, was the very first Trinitarian Christian, and he was a disaster. I mean, that guy, you talk about Christian principles, he was the one that was behind the Trail of Tears, where they decided, hey, Georgia's nice, I like Georgia. Let's kick out all the natives. Let's force march them all the way to Oklahoma, give them crappy land, and have most of them die along the way. The United States has a very, very tortured history. And there was another thing that we had about this whitewash that I was talking to you about. The religious right that is in charge of education here want to present a false history. but they whitewash it in the sense that it promotes white, you know, white culture over, you know, some ethnic integrated cultures. Like somebody, one of the history books or social studies textbooks mentioned, for example, hip hop music, and this is one of the many edits that they made, was to take hip hop music out and replace it with country music. They want everything to be favoring white people, and so everything favors Christian mythology over everybody else. So the way that the history then portrays, excuse me, I have a parrot behind me who's going to make some noise now.
That's okay.
But and what was I saying? Oh yeah, they don't want to say anything in the history books that isn't favorable to the propaganda that they want everybody to believe. So I mean, so our history has become propaganda. They will not tell you the facts of the Trail of Tears or even the very fact of slavery, because some of our textbooks had misrepresented this. I mean, one family took the textbook authors to court because they referred to slaves at one point as workers, as if they had any choice to be workers. You know, these aren't people that chose a career and are doing this for their wages. I mean, hell, this isn't their trade. You know, so I mean, this was gross misrepresentation for the express intent of building patriotism by lying to the people living in the country. And one of the most important lessons for me personally was, and I honestly became more patriotic out of this. I watched a series of specials that they aired on our Independence Day on the 4th of July many years ago. There were 8 different episodes, hour-long episodes about what the United States did to the Chinese, to the Japanese, to the Jews, to women, to blacks, to the Irish, and I can't remember the other ethnic groups right now, but there's 8 different groups, and they're not all ethnic, but there were 8 different groups of people that were isolated by law and suppressed or made second-rate citizens or imprisoned, you know, or otherwise. Let me give you an example. In California, for example, in the 1800s, some 200 legislators in California made it illegal for business owners to hire Chinese immigrants statewide. So how can you have 200 legislators and they don't realize that this is unconstitutional, that you can't have an immigrant come over here and then make it illegal to hire them?
But why would that make you more? Wouldn't that make you less patriotic?
What the point is in order for us to understand how bad things might become, you need to understand how bad they've already been. And people will often say, you couldn't do this. These things can't happen. These things wouldn't happen. But if you can show that in our history it has already happened, then it shows that what can happen. And this is why people always say, hey, the Constitution prohibits that, so we don't need to worry about it. The Constitution will take care of that. No, the Constitution needs to be defended. And so the Constitution can't defend itself. So you have to see what people have done to it to know how to stand up for it.
Do you think the Constitution is infallible, though?
Well, of course not. It wasn't. I mean, it was written by people. Fortunately, it was written by very wise people, very forward-thinking people. But I mean, this is why they had to have amendments for it. I mean, if they were perfect people, if the Constitution was perfect, for example, then it wouldn't declare that, you know, we hold that all men are created equal or whatever and have equal rights to health, you know, health, happiness, all of this, and at the same time allow slavery. You know, and at the same time prohibit women from being able to vote. You know, so it's a little ridiculous. I mean, that then they gerrymander the existence of these very people by making slaves like 3/5 of a person or something like that, so that now wealthy landowners can extort their slaves to vote exactly how they tell them to vote. So this is a huge problem with our country. So we have to see how corrupt it has always been from the very beginning. And so we see these patterns of where this emerges from. And this is the best way to address it. We can't be ignorant of the fact that it happened, because then we'll go back to it, which is what the Republican Party actually wants to do. If you go back to 100 years ago, right, you see that children were working in factories that were unregulated and were mass polluted, and they didn't have education, right? So, and they lived in housing that didn't have any regulations either, and we were doing terrible damage to the environment every way, and we were doing terrible disadvantages to the people. They had no health care. They had 15 people living in a single apartment, and they had to work 14 hours a day. All of this nonsense at 5 years old. But the funny thing is that the Republicans, I have seen Republicans argue that they want to go back to that. This is part of the Make America Great Again. So they want to strip away regulations so that they can go back to 100 years ago, where the factories can do whatever the hell they want, and the housing agencies can do whatever they want. Nobody can hold anybody accountable for the quality of our food, or the quality of our water, or the quality of our living situations. And they want to take away public education altogether. They want to undermine it in places where we have, like in Texas, for example. The Texas Constitution guarantees that we will offer a free education to all of its citizens. However, the way that they can undermine that and thus get rid of it is if they can show that public education is a failure, then they can create a state constitutional amendment to get rid of it. And the way they're doing that is by sucking all the funds out, by sending it to the voucher system, to private schools and to charter schools, which can't be regulated and prone to corruption. And also it teaches that the Bible is the only truth of God that in our world, such that you're supposed to believe that the whole of reality beyond that is a lie, to be dismissed as an illusion. Right? So all of it is propaganda, and they've got a very intricate mesh of attacks to get rid of public education altogether. So when somebody brought up that, well, what's going to happen then when all these kids don't have a public education system to go to, then Republican legislators have said, and I wish I could remember the name of the guy that made the announcement. He said that they can just go back to the workforce. So they no longer have compulsory education. They've already tried to strip away every type of welfare, every type of public health. So they don't want people to have affordable insurance, right? So they want to create this huge rift between the haves and the have-nots. It's the middle class that actually gave us the better standard of living. And that's the thing that won the Cold War. I mean, I know people that have grown up in the Soviet Union and who would have identified as not only Soviet citizens, but communists. And the explanation that I hear is that what won the Cold War, what defeated Russia in that, was not that we had a superior, military power, because they don't even believe that. They didn't believe we ever had superior military power, and they don't believe we have now. The thing that won was color TV. Because in communist Russia, they thought they were making sacrifices for the common good, so that they'll put back the luxuries that some people have, because they're all gathering together, so for this one great effort. But at the same time, American TV gets everywhere, and American movies get everywhere. And so they will eventually see a Russian translation of American shows, and they see how we are living in our country. And when you look back at the 1960s and 50s, who lived better than the United States in the 1950s and 60s? Well, we were the shit. We were the best you could get, and everybody else was jealous of that. And that's how color TV beat out the military. I mean, so that's what causes collapse.
Well, devil's advocate, right? So what would you say to somebody says that, well, what was responsible for those colored TVs and that better way of living was capitalism, and what you're advocating for when it comes to welfare and stuff, that's socialism?
That's another problem that Americans have. They can't seem to make a distinction that you don't have a capitalist country and then you have a socialist country. They don't understand that it's a balance, that every country is a degree of capitalist and a degree of socialist. And in order to make the balance, you have to swing right or left there, right? They don't understand the centrist position. So they don't understand that the United States has always had a degree of socialism, and every socialist country, or just about every socialist country has a huge integration with capitalism. I mean, even China, right? You have wealthy people in China. You're not supposed to. They're supposed to have guards against that, but it still happens. So every socialist country is capitalist. Every capitalist country has socialism in it. It's just a balance. It's just how far left or right does it lean, right?
So it was more of a cultural war that we won against the Soviet rather than a military one, right?
What beat them was the quality of life. And that is funded by two things. The middle class, where was the American dream, right? The American dream was you could come to this country, you could escape the persecution, usually the religious persecution in some other country, and you would come to a secular nation. The greatest thing about the United States is that it was secular. So you no longer face religious persecution. So that nobody gets to suppress one religion or promote another. Everybody's on an equal playing field. And this allowed that immigrants could come to this country and then it becomes a meritocracy where it's up to them to decide whether they're going to be successful or not. It's their hard work, it's their investment. Then they're at least playing the game on an even playing field. And of course, Donald Trump said that the American dream is dead, and it's appropriate that he said that because he killed it in a number of different ways. I mean, because there's two things about that. There's one, the secular state,
right,
and the other aspect is immigrants. So immigrants fleeing to a secular state. So when you've made the state no longer secular and you no longer allow immigrants, we are Europe in the old days, not Europe of the modern days, because Europe of the modern days is way ahead of us. So we are the tortoise and the hare. We are the hare lying on our ass on the side of the road, having dreams that we're the best damn country there is, and we're being passed by every tortoise on the road who they're making advances and we're not. So everybody that says we're the best country. I mean, I've been to 22 different countries in the last couple of years, and almost all of them are noticeably better off than the United States in many different areas. There's no linear measurement, so there's no way to say which is the best country for a number of different things. It could be argued that the United States is the best country for some collective of things, but you have to go back a ways because we don't exceed anybody anymore. Not in education, I don't even think we may be the richest country, but that's even arguable at this moment, and it's certainly temporary,
right?
Because the system we've created is not one that we can sustain. We will, if we are already not the richest country in the world, we will not be the richest country in the world very soon.
Right.
And so the United States economy is going to collapse because we don't care about education, because we don't care about the quality of life, because we're doing everything wrong. The solution to so many of our problems is to do the very opposite of everything the GOP wants to do now or has been doing since the Reagan years.
So with regards to immigrations, are you advocating for open borders or like strict vet, like what do you see? Do you think like we should just let everybody in?
No, I wouldn't be as simple as that, but there does need to be a sane means of getting into this country. A much easier way than what they currently do, and the restrict and the way that we've been dealing with like everything with foreign countries is just it's absurd. It's embarrassing. I'm embarrassed to be American when I see how our Republican Congress has diminished our reputation in the world sphere. There was a time when we didn't allow torture, and now we do. Right? The hell. Right, we just went against our own standards. There was a time when we had the higher standard of living in the world, and we don't anymore. There was a time when we took better care of our own citizens than anyone else in the world, and we don't anymore. And it just goes on down the list. Right, we have in our national anthem, that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. Right. Not for a long damn time it hasn't been, because so many Americans have given up so many of our freedoms out of fear.
Right.
And so I find it personally insulting to hear that this is the land of the free and the home of the brave. No, this is the land of the fee and the home of the slave.
Right. So, but another devil's advocate, what would you say to people that if you just make it easy for people to come in, how are you gonna preserve these values that you're fighting for? If people could come in and they bring their own culture and the values that their inferior values, and they basically change the demographic of the land so that these values are not even valued by the population. What would you say to that?
Within the last 100 years, and we're going back to say 90, 80 years ago, there was still this belief that when you came to America, you became an American citizen. And so you were part of the American culture. And it didn't matter what culture you came from. That's the culture of your ancestry. That may be your ethnicity. But now that once again, going back to 80 years ago, people would come over to America and I am an American now. My family may be from Armenia or wherever, but we are Americans now. And so there was a pride in having come to this country, rather than trying to infiltrate and then corrupt whatever is there. This was the great melting pot. This was where everybody was equal. That was the beauty of it. And the idea of taking away that equality. And the reason that the people escape to this country was because of the secularism in our politics. You take away the secular politics, you take away the entire value of being an American. It was the point of being an American. So one of the things where America screwed up was in allowing freedom of religion, which I totally am supportive of, right? I believe everybody has a right to believe. You have to be able to think whatever you're compelled to think. You have to have that right. I've been to Muslim countries where the natives, at least, are not allowed to not in United Arab Emirates, for example, under Sharia law. If you're Arab, you have to believe Islam. It's not just that you profess or practice; you have to believe it.
Hmm.
That's immoral. You can't control what people think. You can't have thought police on that. You can, if somebody confesses that, this doesn't really make any sense to me, you can't send that person to prison, right? But that's what happens when you don't have freedom of religion. But then
Right.
there's another aspect of that. You have the freedom to believe whatever you believe for whatever reason you believe it. But this does not mean you get privileges over anybody else. So if you get hired for a job, and that job means that you have to go through a security clearance and you have to enter a building with metal detectors and all this, and you're not allowed to bring weapons in, and you accept the terms of that job, then you're not allowed to bring weapons in. You can't get that job, as has happened. You can't get that job and then wait 2 weeks, for your trial period to be over with, and then petition to the courts that you're a Sikh, and because of that, you need to be able to carry. You have a religious privilege to carry your dagger or your knife. I forget what the name of the weapon is.
Right.
Do you know
So,
the weapon I'm talking about?
yeah, the
Yeah.
Sikh. Yeah.
And how are you pronouncing it? Because I think you did better than me.
Well, I mean, I pronounce it the way they pronounce it in my country, which is Sikhs.
Sikh?
Yeah, but I don't
Okay.
know. In English, I think it's Sikh or something like that. But
It can be Sikh or it can be Sikh. There doesn't seem to be a correct
yeah,
version. I just
it's a marriage between Hinduism and Islam. Yeah, I ask many of them what they believe in. Most of them don't know what they believe in. But
well, that's true of every religion, isn't it? But the point that I'm making here is that what ended up happening was people started declaring that because I believe X, I get to do things you don't get to do. Marijuana is illegal everywhere except if you're Rasta. Well, then you can smoke marijuana and you have special privilege. Or nobody else gets to do peyote unless you're part of this Native American tradition, and then you get special privilege for it. And then if the guy goes in to get his driver's license and he's wearing a colander on his head because he declares himself as a Pastafarian, this was a really good experiment. Unfortunately, we failed that experiment. They should not have allowed the guy to put the colander on his head, because just because you claim to believe some stupid, crazy thing doesn't mean you get special privileges other people can't do. So if I walk in and I want to have a lit candle sitting on top of my head for my driver's license picture, I'm allowed to do that as long as I make up some completely bullshit, bogus religion and pretend that requires that I get to wear a candle on my head all the time. Right? So what ends up happening is you let the guy wear the colander on his head, then you have to let the woman wear the burqa over on her driver's license picture so that you can no longer use it as identification anymore. So allow people the freedom to believe whatever they believe, as long as it doesn't give them special privileges over anyone else. That was one of the requirements that a lot of people out here don't understand. Texas legislature, for example, they wanted to pass a law prohibiting Sharia law, as if they didn't even understand that the First Amendment already does that. The First Amendment already prohibits Sharia law, but they want to ignore the First Amendment because they also want to produce laws that promote Christianity. So they're ignoring both the Establishment Clause and the Prohibition Clause of the First Amendment. Why? Because in Texas, they don't know that there is another amendment before that second one that allows us to carry guns everywhere.
So what are your solutions? So you're running for Senate in Texas, right?
Yes.
So, but what are given that Texas is so religious?
Yep.
What are your chances?
My chances are slim. I'll be straight up.
Okay.
My chances are very, very slim. But I'm part of a grassroots movement, and what my feeling is that when I go to California, Washington State, or I go to the Northeast, for example, people don't understand why there are so many atheist activists in the southern states. But now that you have the Trump-Pence administration, and that's national, then people in these other places are starting to figure out what a disaster it would be if we were ruled by Pence, right? Who's a Christian fundamentalist.
Right.
And of course, Trump is just doing whatever the evangelicals want him to do. So this is a nightmare for us. And so this is a nightmare for everybody. So if assuming that this continues on until all the way up into the election, my election in 2018, I expect that a great many religious people will be completely fed up with Trump. I already know a great many religious people who understand the value of secular politics. There are certain Christian denominations in this country, for example, that have had laws, like the Mormons, for example. The Mormons were under the persecution of something called the Missouri Execution Order. That's the colloquial name. That was set up by the governor of Illinois or Missouri, one of them, and it allowed people to hunt and down and kill Mormons, which is why the Mormons fled from Missouri to Utah, right, in the first place. And that execution order, this disastrous, unconstitutional law, stood for over 100 years and was not repealed until 1976. Can you imagine a law, unconstitutional as anything, that allows that you can hunt people down because of their religion? How unconstitutional can that be? You talk about Christians always talk about, how they're so persecuted. They were never hunted down in this country the way Mormons were. Right. And so the Mormons now understand why you're supposed to have a separation of church and state. And there's a handful of other religions too that understand that you can't have freedom of religion unless you also have freedom from religion. That once the state declares that it's going to promote Christianity, then to some degree you have to give homage to that denomination, whichever denomination it is. And so regardless what your ancestral religion is, even if you're let's say Pentecostal and the state is some other Baptist or what have you, then you have to cower to that other denomination and give it preference while you are made second class. And nobody understands, because nobody can extrapolate the data to see that if the state endorses a particular religion, that automatically excludes or suppresses everybody else. Right. And it's no longer an even playing field. And then, of course, the first step in that is never the last step, is it? It's going to continue until we become more and more religious. And every time you become more religious, you become more restrictive at the same time until you get to theocracy. And every theocracy has always been an automatic violation of human rights. It historically happens every single time, which was the great thing about being American. Again, so if you want to make America great again, do everything opposite of what Trump is doing. Bring back the immigrants, bring back secular politics, build that wall not between Mexico and the United States, right? Let's legalize marijuana instead, so we don't even need a wall. Now everybody's making the revenue, and our crime rate goes down, our suicide rate goes down, and people are better able to treat their ailments. We are bringing in a massive amount of revenue, and we've taken all the business away from the drug cartels to the south. We've eliminated the whole damn problem. We didn't need a wall. Where we need to build a wall is between church and state, and take away all the power of the churches. Instead, they took away the Johnson Amendment so that our mega churches now have become super PACs, which means we are a theocracy again. This is the destruction of the United States and everything that made the U.S. great. I hope I'm making sense to you.
No, you are. Those are very good points. But so basically, these are if people vote for you, even if you don't win, they're going to provide you a platform and a louder voice by voting for you, and for future, for your movement to keep on going in the future. Even if you don't win, the higher the percentage that is, the more you have to go with going forward. Correct? So just because you're not going to win doesn't mean people shouldn't vote for you, because that percentage means a lot, right?
Well, I realize that the odds are against me, right, but I don't want to say that I'm not going to win. I mean, that's the reason that I'm running is not just to pull a protest stunt. I actually am running to win. But in the realistic observation of the likelihood or probabilities, then you're correct. If I do nothing else, I'm going to be dragging this district to the left, and I will be giving a voice to the people that are waking up from the stupor they've been in. Because look at how Trump has already lost all of the positive notions that so many people that held on to him. In the honeymoon period, the beginning, the first few weeks when everybody's supposed to be in love with the president they just elected, he already had the lowest approval rating of any president in recent history. And his approval rating has consistently gone down. So that now he's being abandoned by everybody. How many different organizations have quit his administration? And when they do, they write letters so that the first letter at the beginning of every paragraph spells out impeach or something along those lines. I mean, This is how corrupt it is. That nobody wants to be associated with him anymore,
Right.
for good reason. The man is not functional. He is not sane. And he's working for people that are not moral. I'm sorry, the religious right is clearly not a moral organization. They are working for the suppression and domination of everyone. And they want to lie to everyone. That's what religious instruction is all about. And it is the exact opposite of everything that made America great, is everything that could have made America great again, is we need to get rid of them in order to do that. And I'm sorry if I'm railing on that.
No, no, these are great, and I could tell you from the live chat, people are loving what you're saying. So, but some comments from the live chat, people are saying that if you do win, they can't make fun of Texas anymore, so that's going to be a tragedy. And another thing is that one person asked if you support Bernie Sanders, and also what would you do if you win?
What would I do if I win? I have to be realistic that I'm not being elected for a national position. I'm only for a statewide position. But there's a number of bills that come up all the time that need to have a sane voice voting against them. Like most recently, we had the bathroom bill, where they want to arbitrarily create a law that only causes problems in everybody's life, where just imagine that your son, for example, let's say he's a little androgynous, that he doesn't swagger like a confident heterosexual when he enters the restroom. So somebody grabs him demanding to see his birth certificate to make sure he's not a trans person, right? Because that's what the law would require. Similarly, if your great aunt looks too much like Mrs. Doubtfire, she's going to go through the same thing. Right. So you have to carry your birth certificate all the time. I don't carry my birth certificate. Nobody does. But imagine the humiliation of being told that you're under suspicion of being in the wrong bathroom. And then what was the purpose of the whole thing in the first place? It's because people who might have been born listed as a girl on the birth certificate are clearly not a girl anymore. This stud has no business being in a ladies' room. But we're going to create a law that requires him to use a ladies' room, which makes no sense at all and will cause a commotion and will bring the police every time. And so it's this kind of stupidity that eventually killed this bill. But there were so many people, like the incumbent whom I'm running against was all about this bill, who could not see the utter pointless stupidity of it all. Right. And then we had this other bill called the Show Your Papers bill, which, again, it had all the Republicans voting for it and really pushing for it because it would have allowed another institutionalized systemic racism. It allowed police to further profile people such that if someone looks at you and they think that you look foreign, for whatever reason, it could be at a traffic stop, it could be wandering around the street, it could be between classes on a college campus, a cop can arbitrarily pull you over and demand to see, and not even pull you over, just walk up and demand to see your papers. Just like in the old Soviet Union, you have to show your immigration and naturalization paperwork if they suspect that you're foreign. And if you don't have such papers, if you were born here, then what are you supposed to do? There was this music video by Cheech Marin where he says he was born in East LA, but because he's Hispanic, right? The police get a hold of him, the immigration gets a hold of him, they demand to see his green card. He doesn't have a green card. He was born as an American citizen. So in this video, they ship him back. You've got something realistically happening like that, or would be happening like that here in Texas, where you would be arrested on the spot if you couldn't show that you were a naturalized citizen or born here. So again, you're creating laws that only make it seem much more like the old Soviet Union than a free country. How could it be considered a free country with these kind of laws?
So here's a devil's advocate. We look at these laws and we think they're stupid, but there might be the logic behind it is that the people are being stupid, but the lawmakers, they just want the votes, right? So I think, like, for example, the transgender community is the new gay community, right? You used to, if you wanted the Christian vote, you would go against the gay community, but now that that's a little bit more common, then the new way to look to signal to the Christians that you're fighting for them is to fight against the transgender community. And even if you know that that's not going to pass, you just support it just because you're signaling to the Christians to vote for you. And so it might be like, the people that support it are probably being stupid. But I think the lawmakers, they're being strategic with these. What do you
But
think?
then you get the religious right. I mean, there are people, let's say not the religious right. Let's say we talk about religious people who are not necessarily on the right. Okay, there's a lot of these people that are actually capable of pattern recognition, who can tell that the very people who were against gays in the 70s and against the trans people now were also against blacks in the 40s and 50s. It's the same demographic. So that Christianity, at least right-wing Christianity, has the reputation of being founded on bigotry. And so what I find is that there's quite a lot of Christians who will support me as an atheist candidate because I'm the one that's actually advocating for freedom of religion and is not trying to dick over every other demographic. And my position is absolutely not based on bigotry, and I'm not out to hurt or hate anybody.
Right. So somebody is pointing out in the live chat that these things that United States is advocating for is actually being spread to other countries. He's saying that because of this rhetoric in the United States, he's seeing the effect in southwestern Ontario in a small town. So it's not just affecting the U.S. It's a lot of people out there. But somebody also asked before if you support Bernie Sanders, or you could comment on Hillary Clinton as well. If what do you think about these people?
Well, I did very much support Bernie Sanders. I donated as much as I could to the Bernie Sanders campaign. I went to the Bernie Sanders rallies. I completely was down with most of what he was saying. Nobody's a perfect candidate, of course. There are a couple of things that I would have liked to have reasoned with Bernie to, like improve his position at about a couple of things.
Like what?
Well, like GMOs, for example. You need to have a little bit more nuanced understanding of GMOs rather than the kind of let's say emotional ranting against certain things. You need to there's as a leader of a sovereign country, you can't ever look at anything in black and white terms, right? You can't even look at the gray scale. You have to see everything as a spectrum of color because there's so much nuance to everything. There are all these different things to consider. That's what a leader needs to be able to do. Instead, we keep electing people that are exactly wrong for the job because you don't want to elect a senator or a judge or a House representative because they are strong in their faith and firm in their convictions, because that means you've just elected somebody who is unreasonable and who has already judged the situation before hearing the facts and will not change their mind because of the facts, no matter how much you plead with them. And you asked for that because you said that was the criteria you wanted. So I don't want somebody that is firm in their convictions. Absolutely not. I want somebody that is open to be reasoned with and who can understand the nuance and who can actually compare and consider the information given them, so that they can consider that, hey, maybe my first impression of this was wrong. Now I have a better understanding. I think I'm going to rule differently than my first impression had me. That's what we need to have, and judges and leaders. This is the way people need to be if they're going to be elected to that position. Otherwise, you're going to go down this toilet that we're in now.
Somebody is asking that many Christians are single issue voters. Is there something that you think atheists should focus on when it comes to looking who to vote for?
Well, if it was possible for us to be single issue voters, then of course we would be more advocating secularism, any secular political situation, that to the best of our ability, and we should focus on that over anything else. But as I said, I don't want to look at anything in a linear sense. I mean, this is the problem that all of us have. I mean, the reason that we are a herd of cats is the reason we can't be single issue voters is because we understand the nuance and we can weigh out the positives and negatives and alternate concepts for virtually everything, where very often the simpler minded people simply can't do that. They're going to say, well, whoever's against abortion, I'm going to vote for that person. And it doesn't matter what they're going to do to me. I mean, how many people do we know voted for Trump over one issue, knowing that he was going to screw them over because he made campaign promises to the effect that he was going to screw everybody over? You just had to listen to what he was saying on the campaign trail, right, that he intended to screw over his own constituents, right, to do things that were reprehensible. But at least if you vote for Trump, you won't be voting for Hillary, because if you vote for Hillary, you run the risk of having a war with Russia. Whereas Steve Bannon promised we would have a war with China, and he set it as a goal to be within 3 years. I mean, so we can't elect Bernie Sanders because why? Because he was the longest serving senator in like American history or very near, because of his lack of experience. But we can hire Trump, the least experienced, least competent president we've ever had, ever. That just makes no sense. I can understand you don't like Hillary. I can understand there were issues on the Democratic Party. Maybe the Democratic Party shot themselves in the foot by the way they favored her over the way they treated him. I get all that, but the way that people voted more against Hillary than for Trump. I'm sorry. If we had Hillary, we wouldn't have gotten a great deal, right? I mean, from my perspective, because I preferred Bernie. So I'm thinking that if we get Hillary, we're not going to get anything as good as we would have had with Bernie. But at least we wouldn't be in the shitstorm we are with Trump.
Yeah,
we wouldn't be losing everything valuable about our country on a daily basis.
what do you say to people that say actually Trump is actually showing the world how valuable the Constitution is because Trump doesn't get his way, right? A lot of the things that Trump wants to do, he doesn't get to do, and a lot of people that didn't understand the value of U.S. Constitution now get to see it in action.
Well, there is some value in that. It's just it's reprehensible what he's trying to do to the Constitution and how he's trying to work his way around it or rig it however he can. I mean, look what he said about he wanted to punish people for burning the flag, right? They were they've already passed laws limiting free speech, right? What is the First Amendment all about, right? They hate the First Amendment. We were at Standing Rock. Before Trump was elected and all hope was lost, we were at Standing Rock seeing how they were standing up to the powers that be, the oligarchy, the corporate powers that really run this country, because that's what it's become, right? So we need to get money out of politics. We need to get deprive corporations of their power and put the power back into the hands of the people. This is what we need to be doing, and we were actually starting to move that way because they'd actually forced Obama's hands. Obama was invested in the Dakota pipeline. So was Hillary. But their hands were forced. And so Obama stopped that project. And Hillary would have stayed with it, right? Even though she was personally invested in it too. But Trump, who was also invested in that pipeline, also refused to be reasoned with and pretended that he didn't even know there was a controversy there. Because I know that there are times that Hillary has openly lied and has been caught lying, but nobody ever could beat the record of times that Trump has lied. Because I mean, when the hell did he ever say anything true? That's what I challenge people that voted for Trump. I'm like, Trump has never said an accurate or true thing in his life. Quote him at any point, not just as president, not just in campaigning. Go back 20 or 30 years. It doesn't matter. He's never said anything that was true, except, ironically, the pussy grabbing thing. That might have been true for a man in that age, in his position. That might have been a correct statement, but that's what you're going to get.
So I'm going to go back to something you said earlier with regards to how we defeated communism, right? And what you pointed out is that it wasn't the US's military might. It was, the superiority of the way of life, right?
Yes.
So when it comes to Islam now, right, a lot of people think that this is a military struggle that we have with the jihadists and stuff like that, but and it seems to me like the West refuses to get into an ideological battle with Islam. But I think this is exactly the way we defeated the communists, by showing that their way of life is inferior. And I think the fact that we're stuck in a PC culture now compared to then, like, United States was completely open back then, but saying that communism is evil. But I can never imagine any Western government today coming out and saying Islam is evil, right? That's too non-PC for any government to ever say something like that. And that refusal to get into an ideological battle with Islam will mean that they're going to keep thinking that this is a military struggle, and it's not, you defeat Al-Qaeda, ISIS will come. You defeat ISIS, something else will come. This is something that will not go away. And even if it wasn't a jihadist issue, people will continue suffering in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, and even as we see in some countries like Malaysia that people consider moderate Islamic countries. What do you think that, as people, in democratic countries or in places that they have free speech, can do given that the government is, failing to help out people in those countries, what do activists like you and me can do to help out?
Okay, this is a really important point, because this is one of the things that the atheists and the people on the left, political left, tend to disagree on or be confused about. So I want to clarify this. I had dinner when I was president of Atheist Alliance of America. I had dinner with the president of the American Dawa movement, and so I thought it interesting that he and I are some completely, ideologically opposed in that respect. And I remember saying over dinner that as an atheist, I will object and counter him on every ideological stance that I can, because his religion teaches poisonous things. And I said, but you and I have a common enemy in Trump. And he totally agreed with that. And I said, so in that respect, I will also work with you, because Trump doesn't understand the value of secularism, whereas a composite of Muslims and atheists together should understand the value of secularism, since the Christian right is trying to oppress both of us. And so the reason that I became an activist in the first place was because I saw how people were positioning judges and senators and so forth for this culture war that the religious right believed that they were having. And I realized that every law that they pass that favors Christianity or gives special favors to Christianity will only be used by the next dominant religion for the inevitable Islamification of the United States, because religion or Christianity is in a general state of decline, not just in the United States, and it is in every state, but worldwide. There are individual denominations that are claiming a certain amount of growth or certain speed of growth, but the way that, this requires that birth rates remain with students who don't drop out, but the attenuation is what's killing them. So atheism is rising faster than any religious perspective. We already outnumber Catholics in this country, to give you an idea. We are already the third greatest demographic. Non-religious people, or people that don't identify with any particular religion, are already the third greatest demographic in the world, and we are growing faster than Islam. But the reality is that Islam is the fastest growing religion, while Christianity is shrinking. So there's a race that if Islam eclipses Christianity, and we've already created all these laws across the United States to allow for religious faith-based motives and all of this, then they will so easily that'll just pave the way for all these religious institutions to take over this country, and there won't be anything good about the United States by then. And so what I advocate is that you can't fight religion with religion, and people in the United States have historically been very, very insular. They don't look across the ocean. They don't care about what goes on in other countries. When I was a kid, you wouldn't even hear a story on the news about a plane crash in Tibet unless they gave you the number of Americans who were on board. Right? There had to be some number of Americans, or we wouldn't care. I cared to hear these stories about what's going on in other places, because I realized there are other places and that other people matter. Right? But many other Americans just didn't give a damn. And so they have no idea that this is the last real Christian first world nation there is, right? That you either have secular nations that Muslims are already trying, making noise that they're trying to take over, because you can find Muslims that are advocating that they're going to try to outbreed or out convert or whatever and take over these countries. There are people that make these kinds of claims. But ultimately, if Christianity is in decline and Islam is on the rise, it's only a matter of time before it becomes down to the atheists and the Muslims. And I'm not making statements about anybody's culture. I'm not making any statements about anybody's ethnicity. I'm trying to preserve and protect secular politics, because that's the thing that's going to keep us all alive, regardless what the hell you believe or where you came from. And that's what I'm all about, and that's what I believe in.
Right. But, when it comes to you and that Muslim fellow supporting secularism, one thing I want to note is that, Islam, or maybe any religion, supports secularism when they're in minority. But then when they grow, they want favoritism. And then when they grow more, they want dominance, right? But as atheists, we want secularism all the time, right? But the thing is that you can't expect a religion that has within its doctrine that they are required to dominate the world for it to always ask for secularism. They only want secularism when it's in their advantage, when they are not the dominant force, right?
Yeah.
But another thing is that you actually reached out to the, after what happened in Malaysia. There was some atheists in Malaysia, the Atheist Republic consulate there, that they just, a group of people were just hanging out, took a picture, they posted it, and for some reason the government is treating it as if this was a terrorist act, just people hanging out and drinking together, and the minister there was asking for them to be hunted down, and people were sending death threats and everything. And I appreciate for you and some, you, Dawkins, Sam Harris, Majid Nawaz, they said something about it, but you said something about it. But imagine if this was Muslims, if Trump, for example, said we need to hunt down Muslims, or if somebody said somewhere that we need to hunt down the Christians in this country, this would have been headline news, right? This would be all over the place. The whole world would be condemning it.
Yeah, but and it actually should be.
It should be. It's a good thing that happens. But when it's atheists, I mean, we got a lot of attention in the atheist community about it, but that's about it. Nobody else seems to think that this was that big of a deal.
So this has to be a grassroots movement. And as I said, the reason that I became an activist in the first place was because I was made aware of this culture war. They want to replace all the politicians across the board, like throughout the country, so that eventually they start voting more and more evangelical until we lose all of our rights because of it. We need to have a grassroots response to that, where we raise awareness to we get to the point where if you start to announce that you believe in talking snakes and donkeys and magic spells and a global flood and all of that kind of nonsense, then we should be raising our eyebrows at you and maybe not electing you to be our leader because you're clearly incapable of doing the job. Right? Because you're now going to be following your biases and prejudice, as has been the stated standard for so many of these people in the evangelical movement when they get into politics. This is how that has to be addressed. I would say if you're somebody like Pence or Trump, that maybe those people should not get the nuclear codes, because why would you elect people to secure your future when they don't believe you have one, because they are end times dominionists, literally trying to bring about the end of the world. We need leaders who actually lead and who look at the future and remember that we have heirs, so that we should have a planet that still exists generations from now, and that there will be a future even if we ourselves personally are not part of it, that we will have descendants who are part of it, and that we need to be responsible for that. But so many people that I meet in the dominionists of the religious right and so forth, they have this attitude that even if the end of the world doesn't come in the next 40 or 50 years, it doesn't matter because they'll be dead then anyway, and they only care about the next fiscal quarter. That's the only thing that matters.
So one person in the live chat is asking me, so talking about the right ways and wrong ways to approach, to respond to Islam, one person is asking me, what are your thoughts on Tommy Robinson? I don't know if you're familiar with his work. And
I'm afraid I am not.
So, no. Okay, so when it comes to responding to Islam and Muslims and immigration, how do we separate, how can we tell who is fighting Islam as an ideological battle and who is fighting Muslims as people?
And how people come to this country and they become proud of being American, right? The only way that's going to happen is if they have a better standard of living here than wherever they came from. And whenever that's been the case, whatever country you come from, whether it's a quote Muslim country or whatever the hell it is, you don't get the radical extremists living here under good conditions. You just don't. Right, you have these people that they're proud to be American. They're proud to have lived here. They don't get the special privileges that other people allow them. I understand that a lot of different countries, like throughout Europe and everything, they want to be as open and as accommodating as everybody. But what that ends up meaning is giving special privileges to people just because they claim a hokey belief, and that's what drives that culture war against the. I mean, there wasn't a problem with multiculturalism if everybody's proud to be an American. It wouldn't matter what your background was. You're American now. But now, if we lose the standard of living that people can boast about, now everybody's only going to be able to boast about where they came from. And they're going to be militant about where they came from. And so that creates a further problem.
I see. That's what's happening in Europe a lot.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so, okay, so if people want to support you and contribute to your campaign and maybe even vote for you if somebody is listening from Texas, how can they find you? How could they reach out to you? How could they? What's your website, Twitter, YouTube?
Oh, that reminds me. I got to correct something about my PayPal account. I need to. If they wait 10 minutes from the time we did this recording, the problem should be resolved. But yeah, I got to notice that I need to provide a tax ID to PayPal to get that straight. But they can donate to my account by going to aronra.org. That's ARONRA.org, not .com, but .org, and there's a link there to donate to my campaign. Likewise, they can also donate to my activism if you prefer to do that by going to patreon.com/ARONRA, and there's a PayPal link. Do I have? No, I'll just skip that one for right now. So they can donate to my activism, or they can donate to my campaign. Once again, the campaign is aronra.org.
Well, I will link to both of them once I post the YouTube to this. I will link to both of them in the description, and I am going to go and donate to your campaign because I don't think we have enough voices like yours. And once we find some rare people within our community that is actually doing something to make a change in politics, I think at least the atheist community should be supportive because there's nobody else supporting us. So if there's nobody else supporting us, we have to step up and support each other at least. So I'm going to do that, and I hope anybody that is listening to this do the same.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.